Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the College and Career Readiness and Success Center Career Pathways webinar series, Career Pathways, Leveraging CTE to Enhance Learning for All Students. This is the second part of our Career Pathways series, Understanding State Context to Inform Career Pathways Design. And my name is Ellen Cushing, and I'm the Deputy Director of the College and Career Readiness and Success Center. The CCRS Center is a federally funded content center that supports state education agencies in the design, implementation, and continuous improvement of their college and career readiness policies and initiatives. One of the ways that we support this work is through technical assistance support as well as product development. Today's webinar is focused on an emerging need in the field for developing high-quality career pathway systems that align both academic content and college and career readiness skills. This webinar series is intended to support this emergence of career pathway systems and is divided into three distinct yet critical aspects of developing high-quality career pathway systems. Our first webinar was held last week and focused on engaging key stakeholders in the career design process. Today's webinar focuses on understanding the local context for your career pathway systems design. And our third webinar will take place next week on Monday, July 25th, and focusing on coherence within the career pathway system. Today's webinar objectives are threefold. The first is to explore why mapping college and career readiness policies, initiatives, and practices are important to career pathways. Next, we'll learn how Missouri has aligned their key career pathways efforts through its career and technical education funding project. And we'll share resources that can be used to map policies, programs, and practices in your state or organization. Before I introduce today's presenters, I just want to talk a little bit about how you can engage with us both through the webinar and after the webinar. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should have a chat box. You can use that chat box to ask the presenters any questions throughout the webinar. We will be moderating those questions and sharing them with presenters at different points during the webinar. You can also engage with us via your phone, so if you have a question that you'd like to ask, just simply use the raise hand icon, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, and we can unmute your line and you can ask the question during the webinar. We also have a post-event feedback survey. So in addition to learning about your experience on this webinar, we're also interested in learning about any other career pathways topics or areas of interest for you. So please take the time after the webinar to complete the survey. And then finally, we will be recording today's webinar. So after this webinar and after the webinar series, if you have any other additional questions or would like to contact us, please feel free to access the webinar via our website as well as our email. So now I'd like to introduce today's presenters. Our first presenter is Cheney Mosley, who is a senior content expert with the College and Career Readiness and Success Center. Prior to joining the CCRS Center, Cheney served as the CTE Director of Nashville Public Schools, where he provided leadership for 41 career academies across 15 high schools. Cheney is also a National Board Certified Teacher and has taught at the high school, undergraduate, and graduate levels. Our second presenter is Dennis Harden from the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Dennis is the coordinator of career education, and in this role, he provides the overall direction and leadership for career and technical education programs and services in Missouri. Prior to this position, Dennis was the Director of Industrial Education, where he was in charge of industrial education, health sciences, and technology education programs, including Skills USA, and he also oversaw Missouri's customized training program. Our third presenter is Catherine Jacques. She is a technical assistance lead with the College of Career Readiness and Success Center. Through this work, Catherine supports state education agencies in the implementation of their college and career readiness initiatives. Prior to joining the CCRS Center, Catherine worked on education research studies for the District of Columbia and the University of Michigan. And at this point, I'd like to open up for our first polling question and our first presenter, Cheney Mosley.
Thanks, Ellen. In just a few seconds, we will see a question pop up on the screen. It's a multiple choice, and will take about a minute for us all to respond. And here's our question. Why would the practice of mapping policies, programs, industries, and practices be most valuable when executing career pathways? We have 4 options to choose from. We also note that the importance may vary depending on the point at which we are in creating career pathways or the different organizations we represent. Let's take 10 more seconds to get our votes in. All right, let's take a look at the results. So we see 34% felt that mapping policies, programs, industries, and practices is most valuable because it leads to focused discussions with stakeholders. 9% feel that it's important due to the narrowing of the industries that are being considered for pathways. 20% report that the importance is because it provides artifacts for making informed decisions, and 37% indicate that it's important because it facilitates coherence among the related initiatives. So this is interesting. We all have a different perspective of why it's important to map policies, programs, industries, and practices. And as we continue throughout this webinar, we'll see that it's important for all of these reasons and then some. And we'll take a look and dig a little deeper into each of these reasons later on, providing some resources that might assist us as we continue with mapping out the different policies. So today, in my part of the presentation, we'll be talking about the state context and really digging into this notion of how we go about understanding the state context. And much of what I will focus on is the importance of mapping policies, programs, industries, and practices. Starting with a few of the reasons why it's important to give some consideration to this now. We know that the recent passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act introduced a lot of aspects to the law that relate specifically to career readiness and, more importantly for this webinar, to building out career pathways. So let's take a look at some of those. First, for the first time ever, actually, the Every Student Succeeds Act calls out that states are required to align their academic standards, so English, math, science, and social studies, with career and technical education. Now, this is interesting because Perkins has required that career and tech ed standards be aligned with academic standards for quite some time. But I think it reemphasizes the importance of career readiness for every student. Another aspect of the law is the heavy emphasis on career guidance that is now provided in the law, allowing states under a variety of titles to use funding to support career guidance initiatives for all students. And the third part about ESSA is the new definition of what a well-rounded education means for all students. And for the first time ever, career and technical education is included in this definition of well-rounded education. So when we're thinking about how we implement the Every Student Succeeds Act at the state or local level, every time we reference well-rounded education, we can interpret that to mean we're talking about career readiness, career guidance, career pathways, if you will. In addition to that, we know that the Carl Perkins Act that is being discussed for reauthorization, it expired in 2013. And we just saw before Congress went on recess an introduction from the House of an authorized or a potential version of the Carl Perkins Career and Technical Education Act for consideration. It's quite likely that the Senate might drop a bill in the fall. But what we know about the current Perkins Act is that it requires career and technical education programs to be aligned with the needs of the workforce. And if they're not, then are we doing our best in career pathways to prepare students for successful post-secondary education endeavors and careers? Additionally, the Carl Perkins Act will address alignment or addresses alignment with aspects of the Every Student Succeeds Act and the Workforce and Innovation and Opportunity Act. And we can see greater alignment, I think, on the horizon with hopeful passage in the near future with an updated Carl Perkins Act. So when thinking about this, we talked about coherence being an important reason that we should dedicate time to mapping policies and programs, industries, and practices. And I think we even see that coming down from a federal level with the ESSA, with the possibility of a new Perkins Act, with reauthorization of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And all of these create an opportunity for state education and local education agencies to focus on alignment. But alignment of initiatives does not happen without first mapping out those policies, programs, industries, and practices that should be working together to support career pathways. So when we think about this mapping effort, there are some best practices that should be considered. And I'll tell you that most of my experience in career and technical education has been at the local level, most recently before joining the College and Career Readiness and Success Center as a career and tech ed director in Nashville. And so when I offer suggestions, it's coming from, or what it may look like in practice, I'm bringing in some of those past experiences. And let's take a look at this first bullet. One of the best practices for mapping these things is to begin by identifying the questions that you need to answer. And I think sometimes when working with others through this mapping process, a mistake that's often made, or a pitfall, I guess, is immediately starting to look for data and look for information for the mapping process without first identifying the questions that you're trying to answer when you begin by mapping. So maybe one of the first questions that we could ask is, what policies currently exist that directly affect or are related to our career pathway system? Another question might be, what industries represent high skill, high wage, and high demand in our local or regional area? So this is what we mean when we talk about begin by identifying the questions that you need to answer. And those questions then provide a roadmap, if you will, for beginning the mapping process. The second bullet tells us that we should take an inventory of existing secondary and post-secondary education, labor, and industry programs and policies. So right here, what we know is that if we're working in the context of an education agency, we have to get out of that silo. And that might require that we work with our local or state chamber of commerce. Perhaps we work with our local workforce board or our state department of labor. And it even tells us that we need to reach out to the various industries that are represented in our state and in our region. This goes back to what we talked about in our first webinar with engaging stakeholders. So if we're going to take an inventory of what exists, we have to begin reaching out to our stakeholders in this process as well. Our third bullet explains that we should consider using existing regions to inform our labor market scans. We'll take Tennessee, for example. Tennessee is often referred to as having 3 grand divisions, East, Middle, and West. But there are multiple existing regions that also exist through which we could, if we chose to, use to inform our labor market scans. For example, voting districts. Every state is divided into different voting districts, and so that could be an existing region. But I know that our State Department of Labor divides the state into different workforce regions. And so if I'm going to be taking an inventory of state labor and industry programs and policies, it would make sense for me to use what's already laid out with our State Department of Labor. It just makes for a more simple and clean process. Then another best practice is identifying opportunities that exist and also barriers that exist to aligning our career pathways programs and policies that impact them. But as we've talked about, this requires engaging a variety of stakeholders. Next, we should conduct a labor market gap analysis, maybe beginning with federal labor data and then looking at state labor data. And this involves looking at current and projected openings and also current applicants. So trying to find out what industries are demonstrating growth but may not have a skilled workforce to fill those industries. We'll talk about how this information is used in just a few minutes. And finally, we should gather additional data. We should convene our stakeholders and then we discuss everything that we've discovered. So the question is, why do all that? If those are best practices, why? What are the outcomes that we can expect? Well, first, and we saw that this was, some of us thought that this was one of the most important reasons for mapping everything out, is that it can lead to a focused discussion with stakeholders. I have a hunch that most of us have probably attended some meeting that lacked focus. Maybe an agenda was not previously set, or maybe if we sat in that meeting, we found ourselves wondering, why am I even here? Why have I been invited to this meeting? Some of us may even have thought this is a waste of my time. But if we spend time on the forefront, mapping out policies and programs in industries, then we can create our agenda to have a focused discussion with our stakeholders. Another outcome of mapping these things is that it allows us to have data which demonstrates how well our stakeholder experiences and perspectives align with the results of the data that we've gathered. And that's important. For example, maybe we have an employer or an industry representative, and he or she says, you know, actually, we're not demonstrating growth in our business. We've been pretty constant for the last couple of years, and we have plenty of applicants. Well, it would be interesting if that was one of your stakeholders' perspectives, but then you looked at the data and realized that maybe locally there wasn't anticipated growth, but on a more regional level there was. And so just because one stakeholder didn't experience that growth or that shortage of a skilled workforce does not mean that others are. But I think it's an important perspective that you have to consider. Mapping out these things also allows for data-driven discussion. And when data drives the discussions, it takes the person and the personal opinion out of the conversation. And I think, again, it allows for more focused conversation. So I don't think there's ever a problem with using data to drive those discussions. I know that some of us in participating today are probably in the beginning stages of creating high-quality career pathways. And we may be at that point where we're trying to determine which programs of study should we focus on, which ones are best. And one of the challenges that we might be experiencing in a local education agency potentially is we have a program that has existed for 20, 30, 40, even 50 years that we know the community loves, but we also know that it does not align with post-secondary education opportunities, for example. And maybe there are not actual jobs or career opportunities available in the local industry. And so if this is a program that's currently in our career pathway system, mapping out policies and data and practices might help us realize that that's a program that is not serving students as intended and might be a program or an industry that we don't need to focus on for inclusion in our enhanced career pathway system, for example. Mapping allows us to have multiple artifacts as well that lead to an informed discussion. So when questions are asked, we can take it back to the data or take it back to artifacts and answer with being informed, I guess. And lastly, mapping out these things promotes coherence among programs, and we know from some of our participants that greater coherence is one of the most important reasons that we should spend time mapping out all these things. And when we do this, we have to engage a variety of people, as we've already discussed. But what does authentic engagement look like? Well, here are 5 things. First, we know that from our first webinar that when engaging stakeholders, one of the most important things we can do is create a shared vision for the career pathways system that we're building out and articulate goals that are also shared by our stakeholders. Well, authentic engagement when mapping and assessing programs and practices and policies and industries means that what we're doing is aligned with the shared vision and the goals that we've set. It also means that legwork has been completed before engaging our stakeholders. We talked about bringing people to the table and making sure everyone has an identified role, and this is in our first webinar. What we're talking about now is having information provided for those stakeholders when they're coming to the table to discuss mapping and of policies and programs, etc. Because if they show up to a meeting expected to do the work, that might decrease the likelihood of engagement. So there does need to be some legwork ahead of time. What's also important when you have authentic engagement is that the data that is collected is also shared with those who are engaging in the process. So we don't want to have just one stakeholder, one gatekeeper of all that information. It's important that we all have access to that information. Authentic engagement relies on the knowledge and the understanding of the industries that are being invited to this table based on their actual experiences. In Nashville, for example, one of our industry partners repeatedly said, I can't find workers. I can't find workers. I don't have enough applicants. The applicants that I do have are not skilled. And it was interesting to consider because it was not an industry that had necessarily showed up on our high wage, high demand, high skill targeted industry list for the state, but in the local area, it was an important industry that was not being served by our career pathway system. So we chose to implement that program. But had we not relied on the knowledge or the understanding of that stakeholder, we would have overlooked a possible opportunity for students. And finally, authentic engagement is a provides for a well-defined and facilitated structure that allows for the mapping process. So again, when those stakeholders come to the table, when you're engaging everyone, there's someone who is facilitating that dialogue and that process to help with the mapping. And I think we'll probably hear later on about some resources that can help facilitate those structures. But before we do that, we thought it would be important to hear from a state who's actually recently been involved in the process of mapping out policies as it relates to quality programming and funding for their career pathway system. And with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dennis Harden from the Missouri Department of Education. Dennis?
Thanks, Cheney. First, I want to thank Ellen, Cushing, and Cheney for inviting me to be a part of this webinar and to kind of share our story of our recent work that we've undertaken with the assistance of the CCRS as well as the Central Comprehensive Center and the Center for Innovations and Learning. So what I'm going to share with you today is our Missouri CTE funding project. Back in last October, we were charged by our department leadership to revise our funding structure for how we funded CTE programs. Our current funding structure had been in place since 2001, and we froze our payments to our schools in 2005 due to new data system implementation. And so with that, we moved forward with the project to work through this task of revising our CTE funding. So, oops, I moved too fast. So, just to put in context, CTE in Missouri consists of 57 area career centers, and we have 4 that are located on community college campuses. And then we have CTE programs in 437 comprehensive high schools. We have 1 state technical college, 12 community college districts, 7 four-year institutions, and then we have 2 state agencies that receive Perkins funding from us. So, and this is just a snapshot of our funding in Missouri and really why we began to work on this project. We have a little over $21 million as our federal Perkins grant. Our state general revenue, which was really the piece that we were charged with reviewing a portion of that as to how we distribute that, was our $50 million. 96% of that $50 million goes out locally, with 4% being held back to do professional development and special projects, which ultimately goes out to the local level. And then our local folks really step up to the plate to support CTE to the tune of over $162 million. So we decided that we would convene an ad hoc CTE funding committee, and in order to do that, we felt like we needed to have outside facilitators due to the makeup of our committee was 30 individuals that had varying backgrounds in CTE, representing comprehensive high schools, our area career centers, our technical college, and our community colleges. So we knew that we needed to have outside facilitation, and so we were able to secure the services of the Central Comprehensive Center, which our department belongs to, and they in turn contracted with the CCRS Center and the Center on Innovations and Learning to do this work. Our first committee meeting was held in December of 2015, and of course the purpose was to review, revise, and make recommendations regarding the CTE salary funding, with our goal of having a new funding plan in place for the 27-18 school year. So our process and where we really were able to utilize the tools provided to us and the facilitation provided to us, we held 6 meetings over a 7-month period. We had 5 face-to-face meetings and 1 informational webinar. Prior to those meetings, though, we had several conference calls with the consultants, and we utilized the first module, identifying and engaging key stakeholders and defining goals of the career pathway system, primarily to drive the work in our first meeting, because our first meeting, what we wanted to do was to begin to think about using our common criteria and quality indicators, which are our new standards for CTE programs, and wanted to look and to see how we could tie those in with our CTE funding. So the first thing that we did, utilizing the work in the module 1 and part of 2, was we aligned, the committee work to align our common criteria and quality indicators with our top 10 by 20, which is our department's strategic plan. And we also used our school accreditation system, MSIP, and then we aligned it with our definition of college and career readiness. We didn't, in some instances we had great alignment, in other instances we didn't, but we knew that because of this work that we were able to utilize the input from the committee to come up with a funding plan. We ended up, we had, like I said, 5 face-to-face meetings and 1 informational webinar. During the face-to-face meetings, we had a lot of small group discussion and large group work and discussion, so that we got a lot of stakeholder input, and we were able to synthesize all that information from meeting to meeting so that we set the agenda for the next meeting. We had our final meeting just last week, face-to-face meeting, and we haven't quite finalized all of our funding plans yet. We still have a few months to go, but we feel confident that with this process and the facilitation and the assistance that we received and utilizing the tools that they had available, that is a great example of using stakeholder engagement and utilizing our common criteria and quality indicators to drive some of our new funding policies, which was our major outcome. And the other one is that because of this work, we were able to connect some of the other services that were provided by the center. They're going to assist us with our Pathways to Prosperity, Career Pathways advisory boards, and making sure that our key stakeholders in our local and regional levels are making best use of their advisory boards. So with that, that's kind of where we are with the process and the things that we've done with the center.
So at this point, I think we want to introduce our third presenter, Catherine Jacques, who will talk about some of the resources that are available to help states and other organizations map their policies, programs, and industries to create that more coherent vision. So Catherine?
Thanks, Ellen. So as Ellen just said, I'd like to share some resources that we've developed and that we've also found from other organizations that you can use to help you in this process. Give me one moment. I'm going to try to advance the slides. There we go. So if you were on our first webinar, we talked a little bit about our Career Pathways modules. I'm going to share a short overview of that today. If you're interested in more information about these modules, please check out our first webinar from this series and also these modules online. We have a link to them on the slide. All of the modules include a facilitator's guide, handouts, and supplementary resources, as well as a template slide presentation. And what's really great about these resources is that they provide a process for people who want to engage in this work. So not only do they provide key information, but they can also help walk you through all the steps that you might need to take to go through this process. So we've included a few shots here from the actual modules. You can see on the left, this is a representation of one of the pages from the facilitator's guide. One of the things that's helpful here is that it includes icons and call-out boxes, and it's really organized in a very clear way so that the person who's facilitating this work, either at the state level or the local level, can really clearly guide themselves through all these resources. They also include graphic representations of the activities to help the facilitator visualize what this would look like when you're going through these activities with a group of stakeholders. So we have an example of that on the right. Oops, I'm going to go back one slide. Went a bit too far. Well, I can say that there are 4 chapters in the Career Pathways module. We talked about engaging key stakeholders in our previous webinar. Today we're going to be doing a deeper dive into the resources that are included in the second chapter that are around mapping policies, programs, and various industries. So the main goal of this chapter is to really help understand all of the things happening around career pathways in your state or locality so that you can begin this work. So there are specific activities designed to help the facilitators and the group of stakeholders who have come together to understand the full context and landscape of the career pathways work that's been happening to date, creating an inventory of all of the policies, programs, and various fundings that are going into this work, and then also initiate a labor market gap analysis to help think about what this work might look like moving forward. So we want to share a couple specific resources. There's a lot more information in the chapter, and I would suggest if you haven't already, check it out. A few things that we just wanted to highlight today. First is the first handout on mapping or taking an inventory of what's happening around career pathways in the state or locality. This provides a nice template for the facilitator or a group to use to look at the various policies, programs, and funding streams, specifically private and public funding streams that are going into the career pathways work. One of the other resources that's been recently added to our Career Pathways module, so this is a new update, is around using surveys to help gather this information. We know that sometimes these work groups are convened at level, and this work is often also happening at the local level. So handout 2B, which you can see described on the left, provides some resources around how to develop a survey to help take an inventory of what's happening around the state. There are a number of resources included. I've just called out a few here on the slide. You can read about what surveys have been used in the past, and some of these resources also have sample survey items that you can look at. Handout 2C is also helpful because it includes some tips for how to actually design a survey. So you can take some of the items, some of the ideas that you've gotten from handout 2B, and then handout 2C will provide some tips around question type, question wording, the actual structure of the survey, as well as how you might program an online survey. Using these tools, you can help to gather that information from people doing this work at the local level across the state. And then the final resource that I want to share from Chapter 2 of the Career Pathways modules is the Labor Market Gap Analysis template. Now, this is just a template to get started thinking about how this data might be represented. I know that in the poll that we all took earlier, there was a small number of you who said that it was really important to narrow the number of career pathways represented in your locality or across your state. So in some ways, this tool could be used in that way to start to think about, well, what career pathways are a priority. But I think also reflecting on what Cheney shared earlier, that there are many existing programs in place where the number of jobs available and the size of the program may not be aligned. There may be too many students going through a program, or there may be missed opportunities. And so doing a labor market gap analysis can really help to create clarity around how career pathways can connect students with meaningful work opportunities. So there are a few more resources that we'd like to share with you that we think can be really helpful, especially around this mapping of the labor market data. So this first resource is from Jobs from the Future. It provides some guidance on how to analyze labor market data at the community college level. So looking at career pathways that have extended into the post-secondary level, thinking about how labor market data can continue to inform those. We also have a resource listed here from the Aspen Institute. This provides some broad guidance on how to use labor market data to inform programs at both the high school and the community college level. What's great about this resource is that it includes guidance on how to use this data to inform career pathways, but it's broader than that. It also includes how to use this data in a variety of other ways. Two more resources to share very quickly. We have a resource from Rutgers that provides their own framework on how you can align labor market data with career pathways. They have some additional data included in their resource that I think is really helpful. But what I think is also really interesting about this resource is that it takes the perspective of higher education and it looks at what community college networks have actually already done. And then the final resource that we'd like to share is from CNA. This is a really great resource, and it actually touches on something that Cheney talked about earlier, which is the local variation in labor market data and how important it can be to think about the scope of what data you're looking at and how that would inform your career pathways work. And with that, I'd like to move things back over to Ellen so that she can open us up for questions.
Great. Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Dennis and Cheney. So at this point, we just wanted to remind you that if you have any questions for the presenters or for anyone really on the line, if you want to put your questions into the chat box, or if you want to ask it on the phone, just simply use the raise hand icon, and we can direct your question to the right presenter. So I believe, Jessica, there's a couple of questions that have come through since we started.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. So Dennis, we have a question for you regarding Missouri. So we wanted to know, how did you determine which stakeholders or who to invite and include in the committee, and how did you determine that?
Basically, like I said, our committee was primarily just CT people that had some responsibility with CTE in our state. So we're always, we wanted to make sure we had good representation from rural and suburban and urban areas with regard to like our career and technical center, our area career centers, as well as our comprehensive high schools. So we had representatives from a few of our small ones as well as some of our larger centers. We wanted to make sure that we had some superintendents. We had superintendents from a larger districts and from a smaller rural district. And then we also had folks from post-secondary representing both four-year university, community colleges, and then we had a representative from our state technical college. So we really just looked to make sure we had good representation across the state, and also making sure that we had folks that were representative of all the areas.
Great, thank you. And so related to that, Cheney, maybe you can take this question. So who are some of the key stakeholders or people that states or districts should consult to help them inform their state context?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that and it varies from, well, it can be similar, but it can also vary. So let's start with at the state level. You know, I think we mentioned some of these, but certainly I would say the State Chamber of Commerce, the State Department of Labor. You know, if you're really thinking about serving disadvantaged youth, you could even connect with the State Department of Children's Services. And of course, any of your state workforce investment boards. I think those are really great places to start. I would also suggest if there is a state convening board of higher education. So for example, in Tennessee, we have the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. That would be an important stakeholder to include. Even maybe governing boards for other institutions of higher education. So in Tennessee, we also have the Tennessee Board of Regents, for example, so that you're getting some representation and perspective from education and industry and workforce. And the same is true really at the local level. I think the players change though. If it's, you know, you'd work with your local Chamber of Commerce, for example, you would work with any of the local workforce investment boards. You would work with local post-secondary education institutions, so 2 and 4 year, you know, colleges and universities, maybe some training programs that exist, things like that. You know, even at the local level, and this is not a bad idea at the state level also, but recognizing that those who you intend to serve, so the students are also important stakeholders to engage in this process, and I would say parents, because parents are going to be consumers of the career pathways as well. So I think it's important to bring those groups of people to the table.
Great, thanks. And additionally, what are some other effective approaches or strategies to sort of inventory existing policies, particularly when we think about post-secondary and labor and industry? I know we talked about doing surveys, but are there any other sort of effective strategies or approaches?
Yeah, and so Dennis, I would love for you to chime in on this as well from a state perspective. Here's what I'll offer from a local perspective, though. Again, you have to begin with the end in mind, right? Identify the questions that you're trying to ask, so that then you could go into some of those promising practices. But a practice that I found to be quite helpful is building out, when you identify a career pathway, building out a program of study that illustrates for students and parents the opportunities that exist starting from the beginning of that career pathway, be it in the ninth grade potentially, carrying them through early adulthood and showing the multiple entry and exit points for obtaining education and entering the workforce as well. And I say that that's a promising strategy because it may be that we identify a career pathway, and in building out this, we'll call it a full program of study document to create all the opportunities that exist, we might discover that that there's actually not an industry credential that can be attained. So it's important that the student understand that he or she has to, in order to enter that field, must get a 2-year degree at minimum, for example. Or we might discover that there's not a 2-year or 4-year university or a training program within a 200-mile radius, for example. And so as we build these out, I think it also helps us identify some of the gaps. But Dennis, what do you think about strategies like that, maybe in regard to career pathways there in Missouri?
Well, I would agree with you. It's always a challenge. I know when Perkins 4 first came in and we were starting to develop our process for development of programs of study, that was a big challenge for us, was making sure that at the local and regional level that they were getting all the appropriate stakeholders to the table. But like you said, in many instances, some of those pieces might not be available. Some of those people, some of those opportunities weren't available. So that was a big challenge for us, and will continue to be a big challenge for us as we move forward with programs of study and really with our career pathways as well. And that's why, like, one of the things is having some assistance with working with our advisory boards, because we see that as key. And even though, like in current technical education, we require advisory committees for all of our CTE programs, it always begs the question as to how effective they are. So I think that's a very huge component for us.
Great, thank you. All right, so one more question we got was, what supports and accommodations are you making to create inclusive career pathways for youth and adults with disabilities? So, Cheney, do you want to take that, and then maybe Dennis, you can add?
Well, I was going to say two things. I was going to say two things. First, Catherine, you may have a resource that we can direct folks to on this, and Dennis, specifically on the adult side, I think that you have a really great perspective. Jessica, for our audience, can you repeat that question one more time?
Yeah, so what supports and accommodations are you making to create inclusive career pathways for youth and adults with disabilities?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So what we know is that that if we're using Perkins funding, for example, to support the execution of our career pathways, we have to attend to recipients or to students with disabilities as well. And so I think some of those can relate to accessibility, right? So we think of the full gamut of possible disabilities that one might have. I think there are issues of accessibility that have to be addressed. I'll give a practical example. We were building out in Nashville an urban agriculture program, for example, and in doing that had an existing greenhouse structure that was at the school that had not been functional for quite some time. And as we launched this new career pathway, this new program of study, what we discovered that the aisleway was not accessible to a student that was in a wheelchair, for example. We also discovered that the tabletops or the benches that the teacher was using in the program were too high for also, again, a student that would be in a wheelchair to even be able to work with. And so it required some modifications in the setting. Again, if we were thinking about accessibility in terms of making sure that all students have an opportunity to fully engage, thinking about just again providing those resources that exist. But not only that, I think it's also important to address the aspects of a program that we know I guess, affirm that our programs are accessible. And so it's not just physical location and the equipment and terminology that's being used, but I think you also have to invest in professional development and training of those who are also launching those career pathways. Dennis?
I know for us, of course, in our comprehensive high schools, we have our special ed services, which are always available to students with disabilities and such. And then I know in our area career centers as well, in many of our career centers, we have what we call vocational resource educators, and they work very closely with students with special needs, those with disabilities and stuff, to make sure that the proper accommodations are available and that we're serving those students to the best of our ability. And I know that in always talking with our special ed folks here at the department, they always want to make sure that we're serving the appropriate number of special needs and services or students, and our data suggests that we do a very good job of that and making a proper accommodations available for students.
And I think, thanks, Dennis, and I believe that Catherine had some resources maybe that she was going to share, to suggest on this topic.
Thanks, Janie. I have a resource to share and a bit of a plug. That is to say that we have a resource that we are planning to share on the next webinar, specifically on this topic, how to design and support students and adults with disabilities in career pathways. It's hosted through the Links network, so if you're familiar with that network, you can very easily find that resource there. But I do want to note that we will be sharing that resource on the next webinar, so if that's a topic of interest for you, please look out for that on our next series.
And I'm going to chime in with one last thing. I was sitting here and I was thinking, this is not a difficult question. If I go back, we've been talking about all along, the importance of stakeholder engagement, and a very promising practice at addressing both students and adults with disabilities is going back to your employers or your industry representatives, and two things: asking them in the industry how youth and adults with disabilities are supported in their hiring practices, but also potentially bringing on those people, those who have a disability, bringing those individuals around the table as a stakeholder to help inform the launching of career pathways and to ensure greater accessibility so that they also have a voice. I think that's a really great practice.
All right, thanks, Janie. So that is all the questions that we have submitted. So I'll go ahead and give it to Ellen to close us out.
Great, thanks, Jessica, and thank you, Janie and Dennis and Catherine and everyone who stayed on the line for this webinar. So I just wanted to make a quick plug for our third webinar, which will take place next Monday on July 25th from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And this webinar, as I mentioned earlier, will really focus on how to put your career pathways system into a broader context, so into a broader college and career-ready context, to ensure that both any new or emerging work related to career pathways does create coherence across other education initiatives. And so with that, I think we're ready to close it out and kick you over to our feedback survey. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. It does provide us some great feedback, both in terms of your overall experience with the webinar today, as well as where you would like some additional support or information in the future. So with that, I would like to thank you all, and looking forward to talking with you again on Monday.